Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow. This is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 106, After Toqtamish. Timur's defeat of Toqtamish and the ravaging of the Volga and Western Steppe has often been treated by historians as the end of the Great Horde. As with many such cases, this is a dramatic oversimplification and compresses the timeline of something that took decades into a single event. First, contrary to those initial reports we heard in the last episode, although some places were destroyed, much of the Horde's territory did recover. Towns were rebuilt, and people, including those international merchants, returned. Although, just to be clear, it recovered to what it had been after the Black Death, not to the glory days of the Horde's zenith. Second, we're still 80 years away from Moscow deciding it no longer needs to pay tribute and facing down the army that came to make them. Even if we allow for the fairly common situation that former vassals often paid tribute well after they stopped considering themselves vassals, simply because it was easier to pay someone to stay away than to go to war, we have to admit that the people at the time thought the Horde was still there. Third, as we heard in the last episode, Timur did not defeat Toqtamish by overwhelming him with military force, but by finding those who were dissatisfied with his rule and paying them to abandon the battle. With all due respect to Timur's military career, once he completed his essential rise to power he essentially never lost, he avoided ever fighting the Jochids at full force. So in that sense, it's also not correct to say that Timur ended the Great Horde. The end of the Great Horde was the result of the processes that had been kicked off by the death of Birdybek. Once it no longer had the unifying force of the Khan, it was going to break up. Although Toqtamish had managed to reunite the whole Ulus, that did not mean that a return to the good old days was on the cards. And his first loss to Timur was due to a miscalculation on his part. If you recall, Mamai had been based in the west and had led the western sub-hordes. When Toqtamish, who was originally from the east, defeated Mamai, he had privileged the western begs to earn their loyalty and reunite the Horde. This had been a reasonable decision to begin with, especially as the western begs had been controlling the Horde's heartland. But over time, the neglect of the Manghit, cutting them out of the growth and success they'd been enjoying up to that point, made Edigu his enemy. In the second big defeat, at the Terek, Toqtamish had initially outnumbered Timur, even in the absence of his Mamluk and Ottoman allies. Again, Timur had found a dissatisfied beg and paid him to abandon Toqtamish at the critical moment. Some Timurid writers rated this victory as Timur's greatest, overcoming a Jochid army with superior numbers through cunning. But it was also a loss for Toqtamish, who had been unable to successfully manage disagreements with his own begs. But above all, Timur's punitive raid was not the end of the Horde because the Great Horde still existed, and would for more than a century yet. Although, as we shall see, we are approaching the final end of the Ulus of Jochi, and the emergence of several successor states. Rather than the collapse of the Horde, what actually happened was that defeated Toqtamish took his horde with him to Lithuania, as we've heard, and then Siberia, while towns and marketplaces were rebuilt. The only significant centre to be completely abandoned after Timur's raid was New Sarai, which had already been in decline since Biedibek. Trade recovered quickly. Moscow's trade along the Volga route was booming, leading to the growth of new centres, particularly Kazan, rapidly becoming the main hub of the fur trade. Hajitar Khan, now Astrakhan, dominated the southern salt trade, and the Italians continued to trade in the Black Sea. In 1430, a Venetian merchant named Joseph Barbero travelled to Tana. He wrote about his impressions of the southern Volga region, describing it as inhabited by hundreds of thousands of nomads, with artisans, smiths, armourers, and all the other crafts a merchant might be interested in. But what Timur and Toqtamish meant for the Horde was big changes in who ruled and how. Timur did not try to bring the Horde's Volga heartland under his control. It was not his style to build that kind of empire. His campaigns were more about plunder. But he did want to control the Central Asian part, Khwarezm, that had been contested by other Mongol rulers before, and for the same reasons, taking control of the east-west trade routes away from the Jochids. Khwarezm had been the home base of the Kongurad, who had been the leading Karachu clan in the Great Horde, and had emerged as their own dynasty during the years of the anarchy. Timur campaigned against them 5 times, each time reducing their military forces, plundering their wealth, and eventually wiping the Kongurad out. The survivors joined both Timur and the Manghit, but after a century as kingmakers and kings, they would never rule again. In the Horde itself, Toqtamish replaced the traditional Keshik with a new institution, the Ordo Bazaar. The Ordo Bazaar was a further refinement of the traditional Mongol royal camp that combined the Horde's political headquarters, a military camp, with the Horde's fiscal and administrative centre, and the hub of its long-distance trade networks in one place. The Ordo Bazaar revitalized the administrative and commercial structure of the reunified Ulus, and is seen as combining elements characteristic of both sedentary and nomadic societies. The Keshik had disintegrated during the anarchy and was replaced with this new bureaucratic structure. If you recall, New Sarai and other large urban centres of the Horde had had major marketplaces, but these were not revived, and the central market of the Ordo Bazaar took over their role too. Economic and political matters therefore became more closely entwined than they had ever been before. Yarliks issued by Toqtamish include conditions on commercial taxation, exemptions and privileges for the elite, and Islamic legal officials, rather than simply recognizing the bearer's authority. The Khan's mint now travelled with him, producing coins marked with the words Ordu, Ordu Muazzam, or Ordo Bazaar. The camp became the centre of gravity of the whole Horde, pulling in the industrial and artisanal production of commercial centres in Crimea, Khwarezm and the Volga, as well as pastoral and agricultural products for redistribution by the Khan. Essentially, rather than having Sarai as a fixed administrative base, which the nomadizing Khan regularly visited to perform administrative and economic functions. These functions had been transferred to the royal camp. It was not simply a return to the old ways, since none of the new functions and capabilities developed for administering the sedentary populations were abandoned. It was yet another Horde adaptation. The Ordo Bazaar became a mobile capital city. According to the merchant Barbaron, quote, "Saving that it has no walls, it seemed a very great and fair city." End quote. The senior officials of the administration became hereditary posts. At the top was a new governing council of 4 Karachu begs, representing the Shirin, Banin, and Argun clans, and the Kipchaks. This council was so powerful that the begs were essentially sovereign. They could even override decisions of the Kurultai, including deposing the Khan. As Marie Favreau puts it, quote, "They could depose the Khan when it suited them, so that suddenly the Keshig equivalent, the Ordo Bazaar, was permanent, while the Khan was replaceable." End quote. Toqtamish also reformed the institution of Tar Khans, making it more similar to how it was used elsewhere in the Mongol world. It was still a reward for the elite who invested in the regime, but it was no longer used primarily for religious elites. Instead, it was used to secure the loyalty of regional and local elites, Mongol and otherwise. Toqtamish gave land to the Genoese for their military assistance, and ceded land populated by Ruthenians to Vytautas. In Vytautas' case, this was not merely giving privileges or permitting the Lithuanians to rule, as the Horde had been doing for decades already. He actually gave the sovereignty away to the Grand Duke. This had consequences later on, when Russia began claiming these territories. Poland-Lithuania would assert that they had been legitimately granted to them by the Khan. In correspondence between Vytautas and Toqtamish, they talked about loyal brotherhood and eternal friendship. Despite the disaster at the Vorskla and Toqtamish's departure for Siberia, there remained a place in Lithuania for Muslim nomads from that time on. Thousands of nomads moved to settle in Lithuania, becoming the Lithuanian Tatars, or Lipka, from the Crimean Tatar word for Lithuania. Whether political refugees or simply interested in taking service with Vytautas, they received land in exchange for becoming auxiliary cavalry service. Despite Lithuania's conversion to Catholicism, or maybe because it was still so recent, their right to continue practicing Islam was officially enshrined. In legal status, they were a special military elite, fighting with the Lithuanians and later the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth against the Teutonic Order, Muscovy, and the Ottomans. Over time, they become more dispersed across what is now Lithuania, Belarus, and northeastern Poland, with substantial communities in Vilnius, Trakai, Novochrudak, and Podlasia. Originally Kipchak-speaking, they were linguistically assimilated by the 16th century, but thanks to that religious protection, they maintained a continuous identity, particularly seen in the Kitab tradition. The Kitab are religious manuscripts written in Polish or Belarusian, but using the Arabic script. In 1453, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople cut the Black Sea off from the Mediterranean world, and the Via di Polonia from the Pontic steppe through Moldova to Poland and the Baltic became the Horde's key trade route, making the Lithuanians more important to them than ever. But Favreau calls Toqtamish's most important legacy that change in the status of the Khan. As we've seen, the tradition, as with most kings and emperors, had been that, once chosen, the Khan ruled until he died. Successions could involve long interregnums and civil wars before a Kurultai could establish a new consensus on who should rule. Under Toqtamish, with lineage no longer the deciding factor, and the emergence of a council of begs, the office of the Khan became an institution separate from the person who occupied it. Toqtamish was overthrown by force, but he was still removed without being killed. Edigu did not pursue him or try to kill him after the defeat at the Vorskla. He simply had his own man appointed Khan. This now became the norm across the various successors to the Ulus of Jochi. Khans could be removed and replaced. This ended the cycle of purges that had wiped out the senior lines of succession, and the Toqa Timurids and Shibanids continued to rule Khanates until the 19th century. But the biggest winners from Timur's war on Toqtamish were the Manghit. Edigu, as we heard last time, was another commoner without a chance of becoming Khan himself, but the position of Beg-le-Beg gave him the real power and prestige. He would ally himself closely with the Toqa Timurids and be the kingmaker for the next 3 decades, linking the Horde to the successors that emerged over that period. Upon his death in 1419, his own Horde, the Manghit, becomes one of those successors. You may not be familiar with the name Manghit, because it adopts the name of the Nogai. This change is one of those mysteries that no one can explain. There's no known connection between the Manghit, a horde from the east of the Ulus of Jochi, and Nogai, who died a century earlier and, as you'll remember, ruled in the west. The Nogai horde becomes the only nomadic successor to the Great Horde. The hordes of Kazan, Astrakhan, Kasimov, and Crimea, which become Khanates, are essentially sedentary states. They all continue to regard themselves as having a common origin in the Ulus, or the Great Ulus, and to see Batu, Uzbek, Janibek, and Toqtamish as their foundational rulers. And all these successors continue to be primarily Muslim. Until now, I've been calling the Uluses that emerged from the great Mongol Empire the Ulus of Jochi, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, Mongol. Not everyone does this. A lot of the time they get called Tatar, especially the Great Horde. Of course, they're called Tatar in the Russian sources, but only because that's what the Russians called Mongols. This was not based on any particular scheme or generally recognized historical periodization. I just decided to call them Mongol because I think the Tatar name is often used to obscure their origins and present them as somehow not Mongol. This plays into the popular stereotype that the Mongol Empire was nothing more than an ephemeral flash of violence that appeared as if from nowhere, caused chaos, and disappeared within a few years, having achieved nothing. This is far from true, as I hope I've managed to convey. The successor states to Chinggis Khan's great Mongol Empire were absolutely Mongol states that endured in some cases for centuries, even if there were varying degrees of assimilation and cultural evolution. They all developed political and economic systems that were firmly founded on Mongol ideas and traditions. We will revisit the Mongol legacy later when we get to what is traditionally regarded as the end of the Mongol yoke. But we are now entering the next phase of their history, when the peoples that emerge from the Ulus of Jochi, Volga Tatars, Crimean Tatars, Nogais, Siberian Tatars, and others, start to develop their own identities in which their increasingly distant Mongol origins will play far less of a role. From now on, we will therefore begin calling these people Tatars. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.